Who were you before you lost your wild self?
That's what we're helping you explore on the Tend Her Wild podcast.
Through questions and tools around how best to listen to your inner voice,
rewild ourselves, and live the most authentic life where we thrive instead of survive.
I'm Betsy.
And I'm Kate.
And we're so glad you've joined us for this episode.
Hello, Tend Her Wild podcast listeners. In today's episode, it's just Betsy and I talking about a very light topic.
Generational trauma.
This came up in one of your recent Wisdom Wednesdays and then kind of sparked a conversation between us. And you also had a lot of questions from...
Yeah, it was part of Tend Her.
Yeah.
It just was actually just something I mentioned in Tend Her. And just people, the 1,000 women in that, just sending question after question, which made me realize more people are curious about this topic. And which is why I did a Wisdom Wednesday. And then it sparked some conversation between us. So we thought, yeah, let's talk about it and maybe share some of the things we think are going on in our own lives about intergenerational trauma.
Yeah. Well, let's define it first.
Yeah. So it's trauma that's not experienced just necessarily by one person in their lifetime, but it extends backwards. So meaning generations that came before who had trauma that wasn't treated or dealt with or even fully understood, that genetically becomes our lineage. We sort of inherit it. And then we are maybe showing similar symptoms or challenges to generations past because it never got sort of, we could say, flushed out of the system.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because you start to think about the things that you're challenged by most in your life. And you're like, is this just from things that have happened to me up until this point in my life? Or is this stuff that I picked up from my lineage that I'm sort of having to now deal with or face or not face?
Yeah. Yeah. It's far more complex than just experiences that we have personally once you start to examine your life.
Absolutely. And there is, there's sort of a meme and, this has sort of been out there in, social media spaces for a while, this idea of the 7-generation theory. And I actually first learned it from Deepak Chopra maybe 10 years ago. And that was the first time I'd heard about it. And it sort of blew my mind open. And the 7-generation theory goes that whatever we're doing in the here and now in our own life in terms of our healing can heal backwards 7 generations and then can heal forward 7 generations. So it's this idea of like, we potentially have the power to free up our ancestors and what they went through and what genetically we picked up. And then we can make a choice to not move those same patterns forward.
Which frees up the future.
And the question I got most from women, which is interesting, is, well, if I didn't have children, and I actually just talked to someone recently who's like, I specifically didn't have children because of my lineage, and I didn't want to pass this on. So then the question is, does this still apply to me? And absolutely it does, because even if you don't have your own biological children, you still have an impact on the younger generation, whether it's through your workplace or through your nieces and your nephews, or through your neighbor kids that come and say hi, right? Like we're all interconnected. So we are impacting the future generations, whether they're our blood children or not.
And that's a real testament to personal healing and the impact that individual healing has on the collective.
Yeah.
Regardless of how, blood relation, it's much on a much bigger scale than that. But for family trauma and the generational trauma, once you kind of start digging into that, it is really powerful to see the patterns. And I think even just the awareness around that is something the generations before us didn't.
No, this is
it's no one's fault.
This is a new area of research too, intergenerational trauma. It came out of Holocaust survivors, because what they were finding is that the children and the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were showing like a 300% higher rate of mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
They were showing more hypervigilance, more health issues. And so it began researchers studying. I mean, they were such a population to look into, but they're seeing it in Native American populations. They're seeing it in, you know, Black populations, really looking and seeing that, oh, centuries of abuse and trauma is still showing up in the current generation.
Yeah.
So, and this is the other piece that I found fascinating. There's mice research on this, which I talked about
right.
in the Wisdom Wednesday, which essentially they looked at mice. They paired the smell of cherry blossom with an electric shock. And so clearly that mouse learned anytime I smell cherry blossom, I'm going to show fear because there's going to be a shock coming. Well, what they didn't expect is that fear of just smelling cherry blossom went forward 4 to 5 generations in mice. So it shows you that if 4 or 5 generations back, we had a grandparent, great grandparent that had some traumatic event, it might still be literally in our DNA. Now, granted, it's a mice study, but we study mice to understand human behavior. Of course, it's not always a direct link, but there's some evidence to support that may genetically, our genes may be altered by traumas of our forefathers or foremothers.
Yeah. So knowing we all have generational trauma, it's impossible. We all have trauma, right? So this is not something that really any of us, avoid in our lives. But the generational trauma starts to compound when we look at family lineage and things that have happened over generations and how it's carried. So you say there's two ways forward. We either repeat the cycle, or we might say we bear the burden of breaking.
We choose to be a cycle breaker. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say neither of them are easy, because you can choose to just carry that lineage forward, despite it being very painful. We could use the example of addiction, right? Well, generations before me, there was always addiction. And so I'm just going to fall into that. That's just my lot in life. Or you can choose to, to break that cycle. And that's also going to be really hard.
Right. And sometimes lonely in a family.
It can be definitely in a family dynamic, when people have always been one way and you can see the dysfunction in it and you're choosing to do something different, but the family may not like that.
Right.
Yeah. Today's episode is brought to you by Dr. Yoga Mama, which is all the many offerings I have blending psychological science with the ancient wisdom of yoga and mindfulness. Join me for a yoga class, a meditation weekend, an online course, Wisdom Wednesday, which is the first Wednesday of every month, or maybe even an international retreat like Greece in the fall of 2025. By providing spaces and experiences for people to look inward, it is my great honor to watch people become the change they wish to see in the world.
This podcast is being sponsored by Kate Moreland Coaching. As a transformational coach and an advocate for authenticity and well-being, I work to support individuals and organizations navigating challenging times. Whether you are an individual, a leader, or an organization, your creative power lies in your authenticity. Doing the work to understand your strengths and acknowledge the patterns and rocks that are in your way is the path to well-being. Whether it's your career or your relationship with yourself or others, transformational change begins within. To learn more, reach out to me at katemorelandcoaching.com. We've talked just together about our own and some of the ways that our generational trauma might show up. Are there things for you that are top of mind, or that as a psychologist, and then just in the work you've done in healing?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think considering this has changed the way that I approach working with clients, and it's also changed the way that I think about myself. Because all of us, so in my 50 years on this planet, I've had things happen to me that's going to change, that have been stressful, that I'm still carrying. It's something called the allostatic load, right? Like stress happens, but it keeps building and it keeps building and it keeps building. And then it can tip us towards having our genetics turn on and suddenly we're dealing with a physical health crisis or a mental health crisis. But then when you consider that we might be coming from a lineage where there was a lot of trauma.
Right. Our bag might have been already pretty full.
We already had a high allostatic load just coming in.
Yeah.
And then we add on the normal stressors and wear and tear of daily life, can start to explain why someone who's like, I don't feel like it's been that hard in my life. And why am I having all these symptoms, or why am I so depressed? Starting to look back a little further can be helpful. Now, our history is not the challenge of this is that our history, we don't always know.
It's hidden often.
Right?
Yeah.
Especially traumatic stuff. People didn't talk about it. They didn't want to talk about it. And so it just got buried, but it was still buried in our bodies and our genetics. But no one really knows what happened to Aunt Esther and why she was the way she was. Well, clearly there was traumatic things, but we don't ever know the full story. So sometimes this can be hard too, because we don't actually know what we inherited.
Right. And so what do you do with that? Because you're right. Sometimes people show up and they say, I can't figure out, because we have shame around feeling some maybe depression or anxiety. Yeah. When we look around and think, well, that didn't happen to me and that didn't happen to me.
Yeah, I had a pretty good life so far. Why am I struggling so much with it?
Sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah. How do you figure it out? Well, I don't think you can always definitively figure it out, but maybe understanding that this could be a part of what you're dealing with that you can't find answers to. This would also actually be a resource, and we'll put this in the show notes. Part of the Wisdom Wednesday I did is to do sort of like a journey to go into the subconscious mind to get some clarity on like, what am I carrying forward from my lineage? I don't have to know the exact story, but I can kind of get a feeling and a sense. The idea of our subconscious mind is everything is stored in there, not only our lineage, but the lineage of those who came before us. And so you can do some of these tools such as dream work and hypnosis and sort of mental imagery that may at least give you some clues as to how to move forward in a more healthy way. Maybe not knowing the exact story, but understanding like, oh, I look back and it feels like there's just rage and anger. Is this something that I just took on from my family of origin?
Yeah. I think I love those ideas. I think sometimes we just don't ask.
Yeah.
So sometimes, like, I know I ask a lot of questions of my parents right now at their ages, because I just want to like make sure I've like exhausted that list of questions. And, what was it like living on the farm? What, asking. And so sometimes I picked up on things that they say that they didn't even recognize as trauma.
Exactly.
Right. My grandmother, so my dad's mom, lost her mother when she was 7 in the first automobile accident in Iowa.
Oh, wow.
So she was riding in a brand new car, and the vehicles were just coming online available, and she lost her mom, and she became a mother figure then to so many. And so, and obviously my dad knew that was awful, but he wouldn't characterize it. He probably wouldn't call it trauma. He would call it, this terrible thing happened. And so then talking to him further about, what was grandma like then when she was a mom? Well, she took care of everybody, helping hands on the farm, the handymen, and made food for everyone. And, he's told me these stories of kind of how she showed up in her life, never really having a model.
That's so interesting. That's exactly my story too. My grandmother on my mother's side lost her mom when she was like 5.
Really?
Yeah. And so she grew up without a mother figure and grew up sort of like with sort of an evil stepmother at one point in time. But she was the most giving and compassionate. She had 6 children of her own. And I also think it's because she didn't have a mother that she went the opposite direction to try to be. But then I don't know about your grandmother, but that was problematic for her because she was over caring. She was over giving. She kind of burned herself out and burned her body out by that sort of fawn response.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say my grandmother was, the caretaking was, she did that through her whole life, to the nth degree. And, she was also a very staunch Irish woman who was steady and and came at things with humor often,
Mm,
and also a lot of grit, I think, which I look at her resilience, as a young
yeah.
girl of having to be,
Yeah.
strong, even as a little girl. And I think she carried that through her whole life. And I always felt very connected to her because I lived near them growing up. And so I had kind of this unique relationship with her and watched her take care of everybody.
Yeah.
But from a very, in the very Irish way, right? Like kind of like
Yeah.
get it done.
Stoicism.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
my other grandmother was the opposite, and had a very different experience watching her nurture. And I've talked
Yeah.
about her on this podcast. So
So what if you were to think about, are you breaking cycles in your family lineage? Do you think of yourself as a cycle breaker? Have you thought about what you're trying to break?
yeah, I mean, I think coming from kind of the Irish Catholic family, I think, alcohol is definitely was a big part of different lineages of my family, and the story for a lot of people involved addiction. And so, and probably, then the codependency of
Yeah.
women that were alongside that. And so I think for me, that's a big one, and
Mm,
one that I have recognized in myself. So that's probably the big one. And then also, having especially grandmothers that cared so much for everyone, and large families and extended families,
yeah.
and did so much. And looking back and wondering, did they ever do things for themselves? Did
Mm,
they have self care? Did they have self
yeah.
compassion? So a lot of my own work has been to model that differently for my
Yeah.
kids,
Yeah.
that I don't think it's one or the other. I think you can be caring, but still care for
Yeah,
yourself. So
absolutely.
that's
I
probably,
think that's definitely a new thing for our generation
mhm.
is those who came before us didn't even have the concept of self-care. Like they didn't even know that
No.
term, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And self compassion too. So what about you?
Yeah, I think that what I am attempting to break in my own lineage is a lot of generations of women who didn't have a voice
Mm.
and who were very pious, very religious, very um, had strong men in their life that they just sort of allowed to run the show and took more of a back seat as just sort of following what they were expected to do, but lost out on speaking up or speaking against things that didn't feel right to them. And so I think that is part of the lineage for me. And it's interesting that throughout the course of my life, I have struggled with, in my 40s, I had all this repetitive strep throat. I
Yeah.
want to take my tonsils out, kind of then morphed into an autoimmune problem. And so I definitely think there's, and I think I've shared this on this podcast before as well, that every time I meditate, or most times, so when I drop into a more settled, relaxed place, I literally feel an energetic collar around my throat. And the visual I get of it is like those Elizabethan collars that just like,
Yeah.
you know, cover someone's throat in the 17th century. And so, yeah, it feels like there's something that is wrapped around my throat. Now, granted, I can look at my own life and look at how I have a podcast. I give a lot of do a lot of public speaking. From the outside, it would look like, oh, she's got a voice. But I think it's more in these like personal spaces and in
Hmm.
family interactions. What I'm trying to break is that I deserve to have an opinion. I deserve to speak
Yes.
up about what I need. I deserve to say, no, I don't like that. That's not okay. Like that. I think that's much more challenging for me. And I see that as part of the lineage that I'm attempting to break or shift or change for my kids going forward. Um,
That's interesting that you said that, because I do feel like as women, we often can show up in the public or in our work
differently. Yeah.
And so the intergenerational trauma, I think sometimes it's more on the personal level and kind of our own patterns and our own behaviors that show up more in our personal life, that maybe the outside
won't see. I do think there's a subtleness to intergenerational. I think another good example of intergenerational trauma is when you struggle with a lot of fear of scarcity and lack and a lot of challenges with money, that you can really look at like, oh, I came from a family where there was a lot of scarcity, or they lived through the Great Depression, or there was always concern about there not being enough. And how come, because I've had clients that I've worked with on this, that I've got enough money in the bank. I do not know why I'm constantly fearful of there being not enough. That can often show up because of that lineage piece.
The money story goes really
deep. And so, but I think you bring up a great point that this stuff is often way more subtle and takes a little bit more digging and a little bit more sitting with it about like, what did I take on that I'm just continuing to play out? And then can I be a cycle breaker? Or do I choose? You don't have to choose to be a cycle breaker. I mean,
that's right.
We get to choose. So, yeah. It's
a really fascinating topic, and I can see why you got so many questions.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's kind of a newer topic too, but I think one that is going to be transformational in the growth of our
going forward
humanity.
Yeah.
And the more conscious people become of things, and the more conscious our planet becomes, right? The power that work is going to have on, and the ripple effect it will have. But it is one person at a time, and
one person at a time.
Yeah. Like so many things.
Yeah. And if this topic really does speak to you, we'll put a bunch of resources in the show notes. And I would really encourage you to do the second half of the Wisdom Wednesday, where we go into the exercise to sort of take you back and help you think about where am I coming from? What is sort of the sense or the feeling I'm getting? So even if you can't remember hardcore facts, you might be able to tap into like a feeling or an energy, and then trust it, sit with it a little bit. Sometimes when we're working in realms like this, you can't verify things. And if you're a really logical person, you're like, this is bullshit. And if you get a feeling and a sense and you just are like, oh, I'm going to try some different things, or I'm going to work with this a little bit, you might see that there is a benefit. So I always encourage people to keep your mind open and see what you might be able to access through techniques such as this.
And I'll add that I did a reading with a medium.
Yeah.
And many relatives came to me.
Yeah.
With messages. So if that's
enough for a way to tap into potentially what's the lineage I'm carrying forward.
Yeah. And that was fascinating. And it was cool because I happened to be going with my dad the next day to a lunch, and I picked him up and I said, Dad, I just had the most amazing thing happen last night. And I told him the whole, because many were his relatives.
Yeah.
And I thought he was going to poo-poo it.
Yeah.
And he did not. He wanted to hear about it. He was interested in it. So we had this great conversation about family because of that. So I felt more connected to him in a way too, because I had gone through that. So something to think about. It's like kind of opening a box.
I know.
But we're all connected.
That might be useful. We are.
So
thank you.
Thanks, Betsy.
Thanks for joining us today. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. Come back and rewild with us again next week.